Many have called the G3 the right arm of the free world. You know, the G3 is a very interesting story. In many ways, it was the dying gasp of the Third Reich, as the STG-45 later became the Set-Knee, which later became the HK-G3. From Germany to Spain to back to Germany, there is a lot that went into the development of the G3. There's a lot of very interesting history that led it to where it's at. But what we do have is a very long-serving rifle with a very decorated service life. So today in Grantham, we're going to talk about one of my favorite rifles, the HK G3. But before we get into that, we of course have to thank the biggest sponsor of the channel. The biggest sponsor of the channel is Whom Sawyer.
Primary Arms.
They make awesome optics at a great price. They are made right there in that mountain, allegedly. We can't prove it, but I have some very deep suspicions. Point is, we can't say a lot, but what we can say is you should love them. It's 100% Cinnabon July, which means if you reply, I love Cinnabon and Primary Arms and Grantham, we don't know what will happen, but it will probably be a good time. Go check them out for real. We do love their optics and they are wonderful. Of course, if you want to be more American, there is nothing more American than lever action rifles. Henry Repeating Arms is a proud sponsor of Grantham, and we have many cool things coming from them. Most specifically, if you check out henrythumb.com, we can't talk about it, but definitely go and check it out. Finally, we recommend dry fire training. The Mantis system will turn your weapon into a dry fire machine, which will make you a better shooter. It's just a fun system. All ammunition is sponsored for by AAC. We're firing 150 grain and 160 grain rounds primarily. And let's talk about the HK-G3. So here's one of the interesting facts about HK roller delayed firearms. This information is important because depending on whatever engagement you might find yourself in, you can learn a lot about the weapon that's being used against you based on the brass. In the case of HK roller delayed weapons, all their chambers have fluting. This is to aid in extraction. We'll talk about that more on the black screen, but suffice to say, if we take a look at the brass, you can see the striations going down the brass. That is a classic indicator of chamber fluting and is most likely going to be associated with the associated caliber. So for 308, typically it's going to be a G3, 5.56, some type of 53, 33, and 9mm would of course be an MP5. Another thing that you can look at that can also indicate this is if you look at the side of the brass, there's a pretty sizable dent in there. The HK G3 is not kind to brass and typically will dent the brass casing on its way out. This is a very classic example of a typical G3, and again, this is good because you just never know when you might need to investigate brass to know precisely what is being used. And it is it's just, there's no way to hide it. Neat. I love that type of knowledge. So we're now on the range. We're going to talk about what makes the G3 such a great rifle with our on the range from a shooter's perspective experience. Now, my background is 12 years in the military. I've spent most of that in Air Force Special Warfare as a TAC-P and steer guy. So with all that being said, let's go ahead and let's start off with the build drill. That's going to be 6 rounds at 7 yards, firing semi-auto. And after that, we'll be using a factory FRT and showing how that works as well in controllability. So first things first, let's go ahead and let's start with that build drill. All right, let's go ahead and check that out. So if we take a look at that right there, we have our 6 rounds in A zone. That is perfect. That is good performance. Next, we're going to go ahead and we're going to show you what the weapon looks like with an FRT. That's going to be firing very fast. We're going to show you how controllable the weapon is in a CQB-like environment. All right, so if we come up to somebody, we need to let off rounds very quickly. Here's what it's going to look like. Go take a look at that. So, full 21 rounds, 20 in the magazine, 1 in the chamber. And as you can see right here, we have all of them in the A zone. If you want to come over and take a close look at that. It is very easy to get good, repeatable impacts at close range. In addition to that, being a battle rifle, the G3 is very good at making those longer shots at distance. Before we do that, let's show one other quick drill, and then we'll go over to long range. So since we've gone through a few mags, let's take a moment to talk about reloads. On your MP5, it's a very specific reloading process. The bolt has to be locked to the rear, magazine inserted, HK slap. You don't have to do that with the G3. The G3 can seat on a full mag on a closed bolt, and then all you have to do is simply pull the charging handle to the rear and rack it, and you are ready to go. You can, of course, do the typical HK load, and you could lock the bolt to the rear, insert the mag, and slap it, but it's not something that you have to do. as a quick note. Next up, classic African style, which the G3 is well known for. Let's do Mozambique, 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. I don't know when 2 rounds of 308 wouldn't do it, but you know what? Some people are just built different. Okay, we have 2 to the chest, 1 to the side of the head. Still going to blow up the skull completely. Very quick, as you can see, the 308 HKG3 is a very controllable, easily used weapon in close quarters. It's a little large for what it is, but many people have made it work. I would definitely prefer something a little bit smaller and not a battle rifle for CQB, but it is very doable. So, we've done a lot of shooting close. Let's go ahead and let's take this out and let's see how it is at practical accuracy. Okay, right here we have an HK91, same thing as a G3, just the only difference is for import they didn't have the paddle release. So same everything, same configuration. We have the Nightforce 2.2 to 20 on here. So we're going to be firing 3 different rounds. We're going to be using 168 grain SMK, Zero Match Kings. We're going to be firing M80 ball, which is 147 grains. And then we'll also be using Norma, which is also 147 grains, which is one of their M80s. Obviously the G3 was optimized for 147 grains, so it might not like the 168. This is a battle rifle. It's not a precision rifle. It's not a sniper rifle. So let's see how it does. Okay, we got a first group using 168 grain. So first round to find our point of impact, and then from there we made the shots. Next up we'll be using Norma. That's going to be 147 grain, their version of M80 ball. I would say this shot about a 3 MOA group, which is pretty typical of battle rifles. Another 5-round group. This is going to shift the point of impact due to the change in grain weight and speed. So we'll go ahead. We'll see where this guy ends up falling. Going for the top right red dot. Yep, you see the impact. Okay, we got the Norma. Finally, let's end it on M80 ball. The gun's heating up. That's life. Let's see how it does. We have good old, just straight M80 ball. Not the best stuff, but it was often what the G3 would have been used with. It's funny because you also have the PSG-1, which was an optimized G3 for a sniper role, which was just kind of phenomenal when it came to accuracy. But as you can see, there was a lot that needed to be done to the weapon overall to ensure it could hit that level of accuracy. Okay, firing at the left red dot. Oh yeah, it seemed to like that quite a bit. So, seems like we had a flyer on both of the M80 rounds. Shot felt good to me. So let's go ahead, let's measure them and see where we're at. All right, let's check out our groups right here. So, this is with the 168 grain right here. This is our initial shot to find location. I over adjusted on there. We have our M80 ball using Norma. We have our M80 ball utilizing the just the M80 ball. These are the first 4 shots. I thought this thing was going to be super tight, but then it threw one. That's life. So let's go ahead and let's measure these. Let's see what we're getting. Okay, so our first group right here, fired 6-round group. That would be 1.865 MOA. So good, that was very good performance out of 168 grain, far above what I thought it would typically perform at. And I'm guessing that these are going to be closer to 3, which is pretty on par for the G3. So let's go ahead and let's take a look at those. Next one is going to be 2.805 MOA, just a smidge under 3, which is about what I expected. When we got this one, this was 2.9 MOA, just a little bit larger. So this is very much so on the money for the G3. The G3 is not a precision weapon. However, between 2 to 3 MOA is pretty normal for that weapon. Being a battle rifle that's engaging out to 500-600 meters using irons, that's very much so acceptable. We're very used to very well-performing guns nowadays, but the G3 at this point is well over 60 years old and is showing its age. It's still a very good rifle. You just have to kind of check your expectations when it comes to the actual accuracy. I've seen some people saying that their G3s are printing half MOA. I think that's total bullcrap. It doesn't do that.
PSG, one, absolutely. Otherwise, no.
Now the HK is a battle rifle. That means it is firing a full power rifle cartridge. It is semi-automatic. This is a semi-automatic, roller delayed, magazine fed battle rifle. These things are absolutely incredible. They can fire the 7.62x5.1 or 308. And when you look at different types of HK91s and HK-G3s, they'll be marked differently. In the case of the G3, it's marked 7.62x5.1. The HK91 is typically marked through a Winchester. In practice, there really isn't that much of a difference, as a quick note. So we've done a lot of shooting, let's do a lot of talking. The talking portion is perhaps my favorite because at this point I've read 3 books on the G3 and H&K in general. So there's a lot of history behind this, and the point of Garand Thumb isn't specifically the history, it's the shooter's perspective, but nonetheless it should be noted that the history of a firearm plays a lot into being the absolute professional with the weapon that you should be. Whatever weapon you pick, whatever weapon you choose to learn about, the history certainly influences the design of the weapon and further designs on future weapons that could take many points that were learned from the development of older firearms. Now in the case of today, we do have an HK G3 right here, and then we have an HK91. Now, the question might be, what is the difference between the HK G3 and the HK91? Well, the 91 was made for import in the civilian sector within the US market. But most notably, the main change is, of course, the name, HK91 and Versa G3, and then, of course, the lack of the paddle release. This was due to changes that they made to the trigger group that was added to ensure that it could not be made full auto that easily. Of course, things have changed, but we'll talk more about that later. But in any case, this can of course be added if you really want to. Dakota Tactical is quite good at that, but today we'll be focusing on the HK G3. Now, we have to understand some things about the history of the G3. There's a lot to it. Ultimately, HK, which is a German company, ended up producing the G3. However, the kind of impetus, the beginning of the G3 begins all the way at the end of World War II. The last dying gasp of the Third Reich as it was going out led to a lot of very interesting weapon development because, quite frankly, Germany was in a very tough space. They were being encroached upon the Russians, well, the Soviets from the east, and the Allied nations from both the south and the west. Due to the amount of material shortages that were had during that time, the weapon shortages, many innovative weapons were designed. The MG42, which as you know was one of the main machine guns used by the Third Reich, was a roller locked weapon. This later was changed somewhat, and many very precise calculations were made that led to a roller delayed principle. This roller delayed principle is, of course, the roller delayed system that we know and love that is seen in the G3, the MP5, and many other firearms. But merely what I'm trying to point out here is that the HK G3 was certainly not the first to be a roller delayed weapon, nor will it be the last. In any case, the roller delayed operation was primarily put into place with the STG-45, which was not really produced in any large numbers as the war was coming to a quick close by that point. After the end of World War II, of course, many sanctions, well, not too many, were placed on Western Germany to ensure that they wouldn't be making a lot of crazy weapons. This was, of course, eventually given up on. But during this time, a lot of the skilled labor and designers from the Third Reich ended up going to other countries like Spain and France in order to continue their weapon development. This led to the development of the Setny, which in many cases is basically a G3. Now, of course, there were many variants that were produced before the G3 was made in other calibers, but eventually settling on 308 due to the adoption of 7.62x5.1 by NATO. Eventually, those designers from Spain and from France ended back up in Germany, and with HK began to design the G3 and brought it into fruition. What's very interesting is that the German army after World War II, in about mid-50s, were looking for a replacement to arm up their nation. Originally, the FN FAL was selected, which was known as the G1. Right here, we have an authentic FN FAL produced in Belgium. This would have been very similar to what would have been originally selected by the German military. However, there were many complications from Belgium in getting these produced. The best way of putting this is that Germany liked the FNFAL. However, they wanted to produce the FNFAL within their country. This was not something that was going to happen, and eventually a lot of revised Intrufs was brought into SETME, which would later become the G3. Of course, at the end of everything, the G3 was selected. It was pitted against the FNFAL, the AR-10, and the SIG 510. The G3 was selected, and we had this produced by both HK as well as Rheinmetall. Now, a really interesting note here is that at the time, of course, the original design of the G3 came from Spain. However, the rights for producing the G3 outside of Spain belonged to a Dutch company. So this, of course, presented a problem for Germany as they wanted to be able to produce this weapon on their own, specifically HK. Eventually, this was solved by allowing the Dutch company, to get the contract to produce all 20mm ammunition for the Luftwaffe, which then allowed HK to be mostly in charge of production of the G3. All rights were eventually completely given over to HK in about the mid-70s. So as you can see, there's a lot of development that went into the HK G3, and ultimately it wasn't specifically just an HK design, though it was designed by German engineers. I love the history of the G3. Isn't that interesting, Sawyer?
That's pretty cool. You're tickling my chisel.
I know, there's a lot that went on here. But what we have here is now the HK G3. It's very interesting because in many ways, the .308 battle rifle became kind of the last arm of freedom of the West against the encroachment of communism from the East. And two main weapons ended up being kind of the face of this: the HK G3 and the FNFAL. Both were well matched against each other, both had their pros and cons, and today's video isn't necessarily to compare these two, but rather to set the stage historically that these two were very much so in competition. Now, HK, specifically with their G3, did end up edging out the FNFAL in many ways, but most notably because the G3 was allowed to be produced under license from other countries, and HK would help them set this up. This led to a lot of countries producing variants of the G3s that were very faithful and well-made creations of the HK model, though made in other countries, whether it be Norway, Sweden, Turkey, Iran, and many other countries, Pakistan, surprisingly, made very good domestic copies of the G3 with the help of HK engineers. So when we talk about the G3, we also talk about many of these variants, whether it be the Hellenic-made variants from Greece or the Nordic-made variants up in the north where they see the Northern Lights every night. Talking about the G3, let's move down this weapon. Let's talk about what makes it good. Let's talk about our shooter's perspective, and we're going to delve pretty hard into this weapon, as we already have, because you know what? I have weird OCD and autism kind of things going on, and I love being able to kind of info dump a lot of this very interesting knowledge on you guys. So let's do some knowledge dumps. Let's move into this. So now, getting into the G3, the first thing we have to talk about is this is a heavy girl. This is a G3A4 variant. This guy weighs about 10 pounds, of course more with a loaded mag, optics, light, etc. It is not a light gal. It must be carried by men. So it is semi-automatic, feeds from typically a 20-round box magazine, although it can, of course, utilize larger magazines and drum magazines, fires off a roller delayed principle, which means, if you don't already know, that the HK G3, just like the MP5, does not have a gas system. There is no gas that is tapered off in the barrel. There's no ports drilled into the barrel to allow tapping of gas from that. That is not needed. It operates off a very interesting principle, but we'll get into that in a moment. So with our flash hider, we have a typical slotted flash hider. There's a lot of different thread pitches that were used on the HK G3, but suffice to say, many adapters are out there that allow you to use whatever type of muzzle device or suppressor that you could possibly want. Now, unfortunately, due to the operating mechanism of the G3, much like the MP5, it is sensitive to changes in pressure. So putting a traditionally baffled suppressor on there is going to massively increase the amount of back pressure on the system, which is not necessarily going to be good for it. And more on that in a few moments here. But from there, let's move down to the barrel. Now, if you're not familiar, the barrel on the HK-G3 is actually quite short. When we think of a .308 battle rifle, we think of the M14, we think of the FN-FAL with 20-inch plus barrels. And when we think a short-barreled .308 variant, we're thinking something like an M1A Scout, an M14 Scout with like an 18 to an 18.5-inch barrel. So it might surprise you to know that the HK-G3 actually has a 17.7-inch barrel. When we compare that to the FAL with a much longer barrel, although shorter variants were made, that might be somewhat surprising to many people. But indeed, the HK-G3 does have a short barrel for what we consider usage of .308. Now, it is of course a cold hammer forged barrel. It is a 1/12 turn, which stabilizes most of your typical M80 ball, being 147 grains. Now, in the testing of the G3 by various militaries, from the Aberdeen Proving Grounds in America to France to Germany, one thing that was noted, especially when compared to the FN-FAL, is that the G3 is very sensitive, well, not very sensitive, but more sensitive to changes in propellant, slug weight, and rounds from lot to lot, or from different types of .308 rounds compared to the FAL, which can be adjusted on the fly with an adjustable gas system. This is not adjustable. You'd of course have to change out the actual locking pieces that are within the mechanism to fully tune it. This was noted as somewhat of a detriment to the G3 in that it had to kind of be tuned for the ammunition that was used. In your typical militaries, this isn't really a big deal. When it comes to the civilian sector, this can become a little bit more problematic. And many civilian G3 variants, from the PTR-91 to others, typically don't overgas but overtune the weapon, which means that it's easier to unlock with the various types of ammo, this so that it can reliably cycle. The problem with this is of course that the bolt can be traveling at such a higher velocity than was initially wanted or needed in a G3 variant that you end up getting actual receiver bulge at the back of the carrier as that bolt impacts back. This can ultimately destroy and damage the weapon. You don't see that so much in the G3, you don't really see that in the MP5, but on other variants that are not HK made, that is certainly a problem that might arise. Most famously, this happened with the PTR version of the G3KA4, which is a shortened G3 because it did not use the correct locking piece and frequently suffered from receiver bulge. It's not the type of bulge that you want. Very notably on my G3K, I actually had very bad receiver bulge that was corrected and fixed by Dakota, but it just needs to be noted that the G3 is a little bit more sensitive compared to your typical weapons due to this operating system. Now, moving from there, we do have a wide handguard on here. There are many different types of handguards that were used on the G3, from the earlier wood variants all the way through the polymer variants, and of course to the wide handguard that you see right here. Now, the German military used an OD green handguard and an OD green stock. We have the export variant, of course, being an HK-91 or HK-G3, that used the black wide forearm. This was also used in many foreign militaries. You can also see that we have a point to mount the different types of bipods that would go on the G3. So these bipods would fold on the underside of the handguard right here to help stabilize it. They were fairly rudimentary, but they were well made. In the case of many militaries, they were removed by soldiers to lighten up the weapon, as it is not a light girl. Right here we have the front sight post. Front sight post is your typical HK front sight post that is protected by a hood. From there, we do have a Midwest Industries mount that allows you to mount lights, lasers. We had a little bit of flopping earlier on this. I re-Loctited everything down. Now it's very tight, but as far as adding a light while still staying minimalistic on an HK-G3, I think it does a good job. You could of course add M-LOK rails, but you're always adding weight, and I wanted to kind of keep the classic look of the HK-G3. Now, on the top here, we do see that we have something that resembles a gas tube for gas. However, that is not the case. This is merely the cocking tube to hold the top part of the weapon to aid in the amount of weight that we have in the system to ensure that it is properly timed. The HK-G3, due to its roller delayed operating system, requires several things: different angled locking pieces, different types of rollers to ensure that they lock in correctly on the receiver extension, and then of course the appropriate amount of weight to ensure that the weapon is cycling at a appropriate velocity, whether it be for full auto or whether it be for single fire. So that brings us straight back into the operating system, which we're now going to talk about. Now, how does the roller delayed system work? Well, I'm glad you asked. We're actually going to pop up a little infographic right here.
So what you have on the HKG3 is you have the bolt carrier. Right here, we are taking a look at the bolt. Nice little arrow right here. And as you can see on the side of the bolt, we have these rollers that are within the bolt itself. These rollers can be changed based on headspace. Now, these rollers lock into a recess. Now, those are held in place by the locking piece, which we see right here, which has a different angle depending on the type of caliber or ammunition used to ensure it precisely unlocks when it should and when those chamber pressures are at an appropriate level. So once the round is fired, it of course pushes back on the bolt. It wants to push that thing all the way back. However, it is held in place by those rollers on those angled edges. Once it's able to overcome the force of those wedges, those rollers collapse in on the bolt, the whole system begins to move, and the bolt, once the chamber pressure is at an appropriate level, will then unlock, allow the round to come out, eject that round, come back in, feed it to ensure that it doesn't bounce. There's a small ratcheting lock piece on the bolt that locks it into place. That is a basic roller delayed mechanism. A couple notes there. Originally, when they made the roller delayed mechanism, this was of course a pretty big deal. We have a weapon that doesn't use a gas system. Of course, the Germans, very excited, always coming up with crazy stuff. So one thing that was added within the chamber of most HK roller delayed weapons, as we talked about earlier, there is chamber fluting. What this does is allows that gas to flow back between the chamber and the brass to ensure that the brass can extract more easily. There was a lot of math that went into this. Ultimately, I don't believe that this operating mechanism was that great on 308 battle rifles or 5.56 rifles, but when it came to like the MP5 and 9mm, due to those lower pressures, it was absolutely phenomenal. Nonetheless, that's what we have in the HKG3. That is the operating mechanism. And one thing that should be noted about it is due to the fact that you don't have gas constantly flowing through that piston or a piston like on an FNFAL, the system is fairly clean and does operate through a whole variety of different types of environments. When it was a test against the FAL, many people have said that the HKG3 just generally does better due to its operating mechanism of not using gas. When we talk about for example, the Rhodesians, who had several variants of the G3, one thing that can be noted is that you can shorten the barrel a lot without affecting the gas nearly as much as you would with, say, an FNFAL. There are a lot of good things to be said about it. Another important thing to note about the HKG3 is how easy it is to produce. Now, we say easy, what we mean is once the equipment is set up, you are simply stamping metal and putting it all together. It is a fairly simplistic design compared to a lot of the milling that must be accomplished on something like an FNFAL, which of course I have to show it off right here. That requires a lot of engineering. The HKG3 is a phenomenally cheap and easy rifle to make. But like we talked about with the components, HK didn't cheap out any of the components, and you have a very robust rifle. From the cold hammer forged barrel, which allows a whole lot of rounds, to the very robust operating system, we have a very reliable design. Now, we're going to begin to talk about some interesting facts on the G3. Not that any of that wasn't interesting, but let's talk about magazines to start off with. There are a lot of different magazines. Right here, we have a steel mag. We also have here the very ubiquitous and well-known aluminum mags. Between these two, the steel mag is significantly heavier compared to the aluminum mag. Now, the trouble that the aluminum mag ran into is I've never seen a steel mag dented, but I've seen many aluminum mags dented. These were far more fragile, however, they were extremely lightweight. In practice, from countries who use this well into the global war on terror, such as, let's say, Britain, who use a G3 variant, you typically see steel mags used. We'll post up a photo right here. As you can see on his G3K A4, he is utilizing a steel mag. Doesn't matter what you use, pick your poison. The nice thing about the G3 magazines is that they are incredibly cheap. You can buy hundreds of these for pennies on the dollar because so many were made. At this point, when we talk about G3 variants and G3s that were produced, we're talking conservative estimates, 20 million rifles, probably a lot more. God knows what Iran is making right now. We certainly don't know. But we would say about Iran produced under license, because they're not really adhering to any NATO protocols or anything like that. So God knows how many actual G3s are out there. Now, moving from there, the mag well is, as you can see, a teeny bit flared. It's not that hard to seat the magazine, but this is going to come down to the operating on the ground. How good are you with your HKG3? A smooth reload is a good sign of a well-trained soldier. So we have that. We have our, of course, our paddle release right here. And on the right side, if you have super long fingers, you can, of course, use the button to release it. And that will depend on the type of lower that you're using. Now, with our lowers, there are several different types that we can talk about. We have polymer, we have metal. Right here on the G3, we have your typical polymer-based lower. And on something like the HK91, this was an early manufacturer, you can see that we have our typical metal-based lower. So, small little note on some of the differences that you'll see there. Very cool. We have our selectors. So obviously on this guy, we do have an experimental force reset trigger, but we have from safe to E for single fire, F for auto. Of course, these were all in German, so the SEF doesn't specifically correspond to anything in English. My German speakers can hop in. I'm not going to attempt to butcher those German words. Actually, Sawyer, you might know. You spoke a lot of German.
I sure as hell didn't work with like firearms in Germany, so I don't know.
All that for nothing.
I know.
All that for nothing. Now, the trigger on the HKG3 is heavy, and this was due to requirements for drop safety measures, but we can go ahead and try that trigger out. So we have a little bit of play, about 4 millimeters of play, hit into that wall. Off that wall, we have probably, from our Lyman pull gauge, about a 9-pound trigger. It's heavy, but you know what? It works extremely well, and there are many variants, whether it be from the Sniper variant, such as a PSG90. You have some very light triggers, and again, we do have triggers that have been made aftermarket that are absolutely incredible, so those could easily be changed out. Or if you have a force reset trigger, rock this guy like you absolutely should. Now, from there, of course, we have our 2 retaining pins that are keeping the lower and the stock on here, and we have our stock. Whew. There is a lot to say about this stock. To say that the stock is not liked by soldiers worldwide is probably somewhat of an understatement. And you know, I know everybody's gonna get out there right now and say, if you can't fire with the meat tenderizer stock, then you're not a man. However, in my humble opinion, yes, I get it. You're a man, you're super strong, you wanna be able to handle this. It's not comfortable, guys. This is not a comfortable stock. It is not a good stock. In many ways, they missed the mark with this. And I know that HK can make good stocks, as if we look at the stocks on the NP5 and the 5.56 variants, such as the HK33, which we have right here. So right here, we have an HK33, which is a 5.56 variant. You can see how much larger the stock surface is compared to the much larger caliber on the G3, as I try to jimmy these both together. I mean, look at that. We have a 5.56, a far simpler, far lighter caliber with a much larger stock. And this is the same thing we have on the MP5, which is a 9mm, even less pressure. And look at that G3, just pushing all that force right back into your shoulder. It is doable, but God, I wish they would have come up with a different stock design for a paratrooper-like stock. Now, for most of your G3 lovers out there, they'll typically recommend the fixed stock or some type of spur stock or something along those lines. Today, we're primarily talking about a stock G3A3, which would be this, and a stock G3A4 with the collapsible stock right here. So that's what we're kind of sticking to. We'll do another video on modernization efforts from both Norway, Sweden, and other countries. But that's not the topic of today's video. If you had to choose between the stock, I would 100% take the fixed stock every day. It is so much more comfortable, and it really kind of balances the weapon out a little bit more compared to the collapsible stock. Now, when we compare this to an FAL with their para stocks, it's night and day difference. Here we have a shortened FAL variant known as the OSW Operational Specialist weapon with the para stock. You can see how nicely the stock is, how easy it is to shoulder this guy. This is a great para stock. It folds out of the way, and it is absolutely wonderful. Why they couldn't make just a larger base plate, we'll never know. Ultimately, what we're gonna chalk this up to is just those wacky Germans. We never know what type of Teutonic magic and Teutonic sorcery they're doing, but they did something weird with this. They maybe knew something we didn't, but my point stands when it comes to the stock. Now up top here, what's really cool is that compared to the FAL, the mounting of optics on the G3 variants were very easy. There were Stenag claw mounts built into the stampings of the receivers that allowed easy mounting of different types of optics. Obviously, back in the day, it was your typical claw-mounted optics. Nowadays, you have claw-mounted Picatinny rails that can easily integrate different types of optics on it. This is very similar to what you'd see with the Swedish variant. So this is a B&T mount right here, very stable. And on top here, we have an Aimpoint CS, which is their cold weather optic, which is specifically made for subarctic temperatures. And we can see that it is a very interesting variant because most of the adjustments are external, much like the Elcam Spectre. I can tell you from spending a lot of time in the North Pole that when we say everything freezes, I mean everything freezes, including optics. I've seen ACOGs, Vortex optics, Aimpoints all freeze, but the Aimpoint was specifically made to withstand that. Most of the things that break on these optics are the small, delicate teeth for the adjustment mechanisms. By making these mechanisms external, we avoid a lot of that. In addition to that, depending on the amount of snow blindness you have, you can pop down the cap in order to black it out and use the bending aiming principle. If you flip it up, you have a kill flash. And once you flip that up, you have the straight glass right there. On top, we do have iron sights as necessary. And then we have a protective cap right here for real extreme weather conditions where you can kind of give yourself a little bit more fighting time after you pop that up right there. It is not serviceable as far as changing out the battery in the field. This is by design. It's an insulated battery compared to the typical battery compartments. That way the battery can last a much longer period of time. We talked a lot about the design. Let's talk a little bit about the shooting. The G3 is a very controllable weapon. On semi-automatic, very pleasant, very easy to get follow-up shots. And again, the record of this being used in combat is very favorable. It's performed very well in different combat situations, and it has been used pretty much in every modern conflict since it was adopted by the German army, just due to the fact that so many were exported and so many were made under license. Now, under full auto, it is a little bit more stout compared to something like the FAL. As you can see in the videos, I control it no problem. It takes a little bit more know-how, a little bit more experience to do it, but it's very doable. One thing that I have added to this guide to help control it when we're firing really fast, and it's kind of stupid that we can't talk about this freely, but right here on the bolt carrier, we are using an EBO. This is a Greek bolt carrier that had tungsten added to it to increase the weight. This slows down the fire rate just a teeny bit and makes it that much more controllable. So if you're a guy that is firing this really fast, it might be necessary to put in a slightly heavier bolt carrier, and it does improve the feel in many ways. Obviously, compared to an FAL, probably one of the best parts about the G3 is how adaptable it is. We can't take a fixed stock FAL and swap it out for a Para. There's a little bit more to it than that, but on the G3, this can be swapped to any stock we want, whether it be fixed, some AR-15 adapter. It's a very modular system, and that, along with the ease of manufacturing, has probably contributed greatly to its staying power as a rifle that you'll likely see on the battlefield for the next 100 years. Bringing it kind of full circle around to the end, we have the HK-G3. Certainly not the best battle rifle to have ever been fielded. In fact, I think it and the FN-FAL tie in opposite categories depending on what you want. I'm not specifically partial to any weapon over the other. I think they both have their merits, but we do have to note how reliable, how well made it is, and how accurate it was for the time. 3 MOA, which I believe leaving the factory, they could only be 4.12 MOA. Now, most of the rifles that you see will do between 2 to 1, and I've seen people like Henry from 9 Hole Reviews and Firepower United get very good groupings of their G3s that they've worked on a little bit. It is a very accurate rifle. It's a very sturdy. There's nothing bad that you can specifically say about it, except to say, you know what, you gotta be a little bit of a man to handle it. It's a heavy weapon. Pulling back at the charging handle requires some amount of force. So understand that there's a lot to it, but ultimately you have probably one of the most classic, one of the most iconic battle rifles ever made. We can't say enough good things about it, and you know what? We just love Teutonic supremacy. Guys, thank you so much for watching. I hope you really enjoyed this one. I love talking about the G3. We have far more coming, far more cool things. Check them out. That's all we got for you guys. A final thing for you guys, give me a little bit of dad advice. You know what? Cardio is going to keep you alive, so keep doing your cardio, guys, whether it be sitting on the Stairmaster, that's my go-to, and just stepping for hours at a time, or whether it be getting out and hiking and doing some runs. You're only young enough to do this stuff for so long, so make sure you get to it. Guys, don't forget the Patreon. It is full of all the best stuff, and that is it. Thank you so watching so much, guys. I've always appreciated you.
Oh, there you go.